We now have the pleasure of being joined by Tom Luginbill, college football analyst and director of scouting for ESPN. Tom, thank you so much for taking some time to join us. How are you doing on this Wednesday afternoon?
I'm doing great. If I was any better, there'd be two of me, man. I'm doing all right.
Happy to have you here on the show. Looking at
Thank you.
Syracuse football, know you've done a couple of the games over the
Yeah.
past couple of weeks. What have you seen from your time watching the Orange? I know they haven't been the most competitive football games, but what's your take on Syracuse in 2023?
It's interesting because it looks like the season's starting to unfold the way the season did a year ago, which, down the stretch as the schedule gets more difficult, you start to get banged up. It's almost like it's the same script. And I feel for them in that regard because, you get to 4-0, and the next thing you know, three teams in a row, you're sitting there at Clemson, North Carolina, FSU. And there's a lot of teams that wouldn't come out of that unscathed or even go into that 3-game skid and play overly well. I think they've been bitten by the injury bug once again. It looked there slightly like Damian Alford, especially off of the Army game, was going to kind of start to emerge and maybe replace that void left by the injury to Rondé Gadsden. And then I felt like they just regressed with the Clemson game, the game that we had, and then further regressed the following week, another game that we had against North Carolina on the road. And so it's been a multitude of things. They don't have a lot of depth at running back, but I think LaQuinn Allen is really, really good. Offensive line, I think, is a bit of a work in progress. Garrett Schrader has been up and down. I think he's played really well at times, and then I think at other times he just doesn't have a lot of helper. They don't have a lot of playmakers that have just emerged. And, the Clemson game, if you go back to that, when it kind of started the downhill turn, most of that game was created by self-inflicted wounds, particularly in the first quarter. The turnover on the first drive and then the turnover on the next drive that was on your own, if I recall, I feel like it was their own 15, 20-yard line. So right out of the gate, it's 14-0. And against a team like Clemson, that's a difficult hill to overcome. So defensively, they've just been on the field too long. Rocky Long's scheme is tried and true. They've got some pass rushers. I really like them in the defensive secondary across the board, both corners, the two safeties. But they're on the field an awful lot. And I don't care who you are, you get worn down, you get tired. If you get an injury here or there, it really wears on you. And we're at that point in the season right now where you kind of know what you are, and if you're banged up and injured, you know that it's going to be a battle of attrition to get to the end. If you're a team that's fortunate enough to be healthy and to be on the winning side of some close games, then you're feeling better at this point because you can kind of see a light at the end of the tunnel. Where is Syracuse in that regard right now? I think they're reeling a little bit, and they're probably frustrated. They know they're a better team than the team that they put on the field each of the last 3 weeks, but they're not the better team on the field the last 3 weeks. And again, self-inflicted wounds are a killer. If you're not going to help yourself, it's tough to win games, particularly when 2 out of the 3 are on the road.
You mentioned the similarities to last year after they started 6-0 and then lost a bunch in a row. It's kind of similar where they got to better opponents, and that's when their downfall kind of started. What does that say necessarily about Syracuse and where their football program is at, where they haven't been able to really compete with the top dogs in the ACC the last 2 years?
Well, first of all, from a recruiting standpoint, I think it's a hard job. And it's a hard job because you don't have just this deep pool in state to draw from each and every year. So you might have a couple of guys here, a couple of guys there, but the reality of the situation is to build your program or to sustain or create improvement in the program, you're going to have to go into everybody else's backyard and compete against them for their own players. That's hard to do. You've got weather elements that come into play. I do think it's really important what's happening right now facility-wise to finally have the upgrades that you need to compete. If you're going to be in the ACC and, you're competing with Pitt against the guy and let's just say you're competing with Virginia Tech and this and that, when you bring that kid on campus, you've got to be able to show that there's a commitment to excellence in football by the investment that the university is making. And you know what? It's probably been 15 years overdue. I think John Wildhack, the AD, knows that. He realizes that you can't compete in today's climate, whether it's NIL, the transfer portal, the arms race, the facilities upgrades and resources. They needed to up their game there, and they're starting to do that, which I think is really important. But at the end of the day, they're just not as talented as the teams that they're playing that are better or deeper than they are. I just think that, you look at some programs like Clemson, all right, for example. Clemson, Dabo Swinney could throw a rock outside of his office and hit an elite player within 50 miles in every direction, right? Georgia can do that. Alabama can do that. Auburn, LSU can do that. The proximity to players when you're in that Southeast footprint is different than when you're in the Northeast, or if you're in upstate New York, or even in some places in the Midwest. And so there's a lot of other challenges at play for that place than maybe there are for some of their competitors within the conference.
So on that talent point, if you're not going to be getting these elite players year in and year out, that puts more of an onus on the coaching staff to develop your three-star prospects. So when you look at Dino Babers now this is his 8th season as head coach, as soon as things start to spiral, people in Syracuse are always calling for Dino's job. So from a national perspective, what is your thought on what Dino Babers has done over 8 seasons as head coach? And, if there was a change to be made, because I know his contract, I believe, is up after next year. So this year could be a year you make a change. Who would even be a logical replacement to come and take over at Syracuse?
Boy, that is a really, really good question. Number one, I hate speaking on coaches and their job status because obviously, that's a very sensitive subject. But he knows that they've got to win more games than they have. I do think he's provided some respectability to the program, and they've gone out at times and they've played really good. I mean, you look at their schedule. I understand, who they've played early on, but you do have some Power 5 teams in there, right? You've got a service academy. Nobody ever wants to play the service academies. It's like it's a no-win proposition, and so you get past that one. That's a positive. That's a good thing. But I think there are times you look at. There are moments in every tenure where you could almost point to a game, right? And I point to the Syracuse-Clemson game when Trevor Lawrence went down and Chase Bryce comes in. If you guys, I'm sure, remember this, and saves them. And that was a very winnable game. And sometimes those moments, those games are the hurdle. And when you get past that, everything kind of takes care of itself, or at least you create some sustained momentum. I feel like they haven't had that moment yet. They haven't had that opportunity. And you either make some of those opportunities or you get good enough to make multiple opportunities. You bring up a very good point, though, on player development. A lot of people, if you hear the phrase, oh, well, that's a developmental program, they take that to mean a negative connotation. I don't look at it that way. I look at it as, if you are going to have to go, it's hard. Like, it's one thing to turn on the tape of Jadeveon Clowney or turn on the tape of Marvin Harrison and say, well, that guy's a great player. Well, yeah, duh. That's why everybody's recruiting. And your margin for error in missing is minimized the better the player is, right? But when you're having to identify guys that aren't maybe college ready right away, that aren't going to come in and just make that leap and be a difference maker for you, it's a much bigger projection. And when you're making a projection, there are many more variables for failure, and it makes it harder, right? So I think when you are a developmental program, you have to identify, number one, what kind of player he is, what kind of person he is. Does he fit? Like, is there a blue collar element? Because I feel like there's a bit of a blue collar element to Syracuse football. And I think, whether it's weather, toughness, all of those sorts of things, you're going to identify a guy that you think has those traits, but at the same time, he might be an inch and a half short. He might be 20 pounds lighter. And you're saying, okay, we're going to project forward on this guy. We feel like you're the acronym OKG, our kind of guy. We think he's an OKG, but we have to look at him as a redshirt sophomore. What do we think he's going to be? Because he's not that right now. That's hard, man. Like, that's really, really hard. Because, again, there's a large margin of error, and you're going to end up missing on some guys, unfortunately, when you do that. And you're going to miss on the top level. I mean, Alabama's missing on guys. Ohio State's missing on guys. It happens everywhere. but I just think it makes the job harder because there are so fewer definitives when it comes to player evaluation when you're projecting than there is, looking at Calvin Ridley or, looking at Julio Jones, and it's glaring.
And for Syracuse, they need to develop these players, their OKGs, to become a sustainable winning program. Because I think, you see, a 10-win season in 2018, like you were mentioning that game against Clemson, but there hasn't really been anything close to that since then. So when you look at, a big topic that a lot of us who work together have been discussing is like, what is the ceiling for Syracuse if they're able to develop a sustainable winning culture? Some people say, it's just making a bowl game every year and getting to 6 or 7 wins. Some people have loftier expectations. They should be striving for 9 or 10 wins. Where do you fall on that spectrum from a Syracuse perspective?
It's a really good question, and I think you kind of have to historically look at the program through different evolutions, whether it was Coach Mack, then Pasqualoni, and you kind of move up and you've seen sustained success. You've seen NFL caliber players. You've seen 10-win seasons, 11-win seasons. But I also think you need to look at that through the lens of today's landscape. And today's landscape is more difficult than it has ever been with social media, the transfer portal, name, image, and likeness. Because those OKGs, you might be able to develop them into a great player. Well, how are you going to keep them? That's the other part of this. So you've done your job, and look at Jahar Jordan at Louisville, right? I mean, there's a prime example of one. And so you develop the guy. Now, how do you keep him? And again, that's where the investment on behalf of the university is, the NIL collective. Are you putting your franchise in a position, if you develop a great player, to keep him there, right? That's part of it. But I would say the win side of it, if you're trying to look at programs that you would consider to be maybe kind of comparable, when I say comparable with some of the same challenges, like Rutgers is comparable with some of the same challenges. Boston College is comparable with some of the same challenges. I think it's, on average, you'd like to say 6 to 8 wins. But then I also look at a program like an Iowa, where you say, okay, you're going to get those in there, and then you're going to bust out a 10 or 11 win. But you know what? 2 to 3 years later, you're going to have a 4-8. I just think that's kind of what it is, because if you are a developmental program, here's what ends up happening. And I say this, we don't have enough data yet to support this going forward with name, image, and likeness in the transfer portal, but leading up to it, developmental programs, Iowa State, Michigan State is a great example under Mark D'Antonio. If you go back and you look at their 2 deep, when they've had their greatest seasons, they are littered with players that are redshirt seniors and redshirt juniors. And then all of a sudden, when all of those guys move on and they graduate, guess what? They take a dip because they're a developmental program. So now the redshirt freshman and the redshirt sophomore is not that guy that just left. So then you have a 4-8 or you have a 5-7. And then 2 years later, those same guys are redshirt juniors, redshirt seniors. And now you're back up into that 9-win, kind of area, or 10 or whatever it may be. So I do think it's possible. Like I said, not having enough data going forward on the transfer portal and name, image, and likeness and how it will impact that is, how do you keep everybody happy, and how do you keep everybody into the program? If you do develop a bunch of guys that turn into really, really good players, how do you stop them from leaving? And it's a very real question. And it's unfortunately the world that we're living in, right now. And it's easy to go out and just say, well, just out coach them. Well, coaches don't have any eligibility left, man. I mean, it's players, not plays. It's Jimmys and Joes, not X's and O's. And you guys have heard all of those cliches before, and they are all 100% true. And so I do think it's a sustainable bowl team, or should be, or is capable of being. But I will say this under Dino, not to defend or not to make excuses, but this has been an incredibly injury-riddled roster, particularly over the last 4 to 5 years, across the board. And it's hard to sustain that. And for whatever reason, I don't know what that is. Do you need to start researching how you're going about your strength and conditioning program? Do you need to start researching, are we doing the right things in athletic training? Are we doing the right things in nutrition and health with all the resources that these teams have now? Why are we so injured? And I think it's a fair question.
Yeah, I think if I have it correctly, this is the first summer that Syracuse football has had a nutritionist. If I think I've heard that correctly, but focusing on the ACC, FSU is one of those teams that really hit the transfer portal and remade their roster through NIL.
Yeah.
And the ACC has really been one of the most impressive conferences going from what they did last year to this year. 4 teams in the top 25 right now, not including Clemson and Miami. What have you seen from the conference as a whole, and where do you think it stands at this point within the Power Five and beyond?
Well, the competitive depth in the quarterback play is what stands out to me initially. You know, whether it's been Thomas Castellanos coming on at Boston College, I call him Diet Kyler Murray. That's exactly what he looks just like him. Whether it's been, Jack Plummer at Louisville. Tyler Van Dyke at times has looked really, really good under Shannon Dawson at Miami. Drake May's actually playing better football, but statistically it doesn't look like that because they're so good now running the game, running the football. They're a power run team. Clemson's starting to come into their own. Obviously, we know about Jordan Travis, but the balance top to bottom, and you referenced Florida State and the job they've done in the transfer portal. You could make an argument that they've hit on more guys in the transfer portal than any other team in America. I mean, when you look at the players there, whether it was Jared Verse last year, all right, whether it's Braden Fisk this year, whether it's Keon Coleman this year, Jaheim Bell, Trey Benson was at Oregon, like all of their marquee difference maker guys were from somewhere else, and they've hit on all of them, which is rare. You're going to miss. Okay, so they just had one of those cycles where everything's going really, really well. You could say, remember North Carolina last year, how bad they were on defense? Then they go out and they get 2 or 3 guys in the front from the portal, and they get 2 guys in the secondary. One of them was from the FCS level, and the other one was from the Group of 5 level, and both of them were better than what they had. So, like, go figure, right? I mean, those two, Elijah Huzzy and Stick Lane, between the two of them, came into the North Carolina program with 23 combined interceptions over the last 3 or 4 years, whether East Tennessee State was Huzzy and Lane was at Georgia State. So, like, they've hit on the transfer portal side of it in a really positive way. So I just think the ACC is a little similar to the Pac-12 in the sense that the quarterback play is really good. The teams are extremely evenly matched. I mean, guys, we could be sitting here. I had the Boston College Florida State game, and you guys have watched the Florida State Clemson game. FSU could very easily have 2 losses. Very easily have 2 losses, but they found a way to win the game. Credit to them, they won the game. But that's the point that I'm making is you could almost lose to a Boston College that at the time is the most penalized team in college football through week 3, but then you could also almost lose to the team that has reigned supreme in the ACC a week later or 2 weeks later. So everything it's one of those deals where you go into the game and it's like margin of error is really, really small. And then if you catch NC State on the wrong day, obviously Dave Clawson's such a good coach at Wake, but they're having a down year. I don't think people truly respect how good Duke is on defense. Like NC State last week, how about this? Duke wins that game 24-3. They are 1 of 9 on 3rd down. They turned the ball over. They were 4-12 passing for the entire game. They had 98 total yards of offense in the second half, and they only had the ball 23 minutes during the entire game and won the game 24-3. Like, that's playing defense, man, and did it with a backup quarterback. So I think the league's a lot of fun. It's as strong as it's ever been, and it's been a good year so far.
Yeah, last 2 seasons, the ACC hasn't gotten a team in the college football playoff, and when you see Florida State undefeated, ranked 4th in the country in the AP poll, Clemson has been the only team to get in the playoff from the ACC since Florida State in the inaugural season of the playoff. When you look at the conference and its strength, and you talk about, this is a resurgent year. I know there are a lot of other factors here, but do you think it's possible the ACC could get a 1-loss conference champ in the playoff, or do you think it has to be an undefeated ACC champion has to be the team that gets in the playoff?
I don't think we know yet. I think it's certainly probable that you could have 1 loss and get in. I think a lot of that has to do with how high can North Carolina rise, and where, is Florida State still tinkering in that top 5 range? Because quite honestly, if you look, because in order to answer that question, you also have to look outside of the conference, because the Pac-12 could very well cannibalize itself. I mean, those games are all going to be one possession games with great quarterback play. And, I personally think, I think SC could lose 2 or 3 more games with the schedule they've got coming up, right?
Washington has a crazy schedule still to
Washington's
play.
got a crazy schedule. Absolutely. So, there's going to be a lot that can happen in that conference. When you see Georgia, you see Michigan, they seem to kind of be a cut above. But, I think you could take Ohio State, Florida State, Penn State, Washington, maybe a couple, Oklahoma, and just throw them all up against the wall and see who sticks. I think they're all really good. They're undefeated. We're going to find out about Ohio State and Penn State. So what other conferences would have an impact, I think, on an ACC team having one loss getting in. But I think it's probably more probable than it has been in years past, because we've already seen Alabama with a loss. We've seen Texas with a loss. SC now has a loss. Oregon now has a loss. So, yeah, I think it's certainly possible.
We talked a lot about recruiting. Obviously, going forward, the ACC is going to have 3 new teams: Stanford, Cal, and SMU. With those new additions, does that positively, negatively impact Syracuse, or does it not do too much in terms of the competition and the recruiting sense?
I don't know if it negatively or positively affects it either way, because, so much of recruiting too is time well spent. Would we be helping ourselves and utilizing our time well and our manpower well by spending a bunch of time in California? All right. How many of those guys are you going to get? Right. Or now they'll spend time in Texas, because Dino's got a distinct history in that state, and they should spend time there. But I don't know if they necessarily need to do that, unless there's a legacy guy, or there's somebody out there that for some reason wants to, let's just say, get into broadcasting. He's a really good football player, and everybody knows the history of Syracuse in terms of broadcasting. I would venture a guess that they'll stay on the Eastern Seaboard. Florida, if you're going to dip into Georgia, the Carolinas, obviously the DMV, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, that tri-state area is really important for Syracuse. And then getting into Pittsburgh, getting into the Philadelphia area, the private school areas there. To me, that is time well spent, because I don't know if your efforts and your manpower are going to see the fruits of the labor if you spend a bunch of time out in California just trying to expand your brand when it may not matter.
Did you think that expansion of those 3 teams was good for the ACC? And, with the 3 teams that voted against it, in North Carolina, Clemson, and Florida State. I saw there was a piece that came out today about why NC State flipped and did end up voting for expanding. How do you think those teams impact the conference?
I think in our world right now, the college football landscape and where we are with everybody jockeying for position, right? I think everybody's trying to survive, quite honestly, and they don't want to be left without a chair when the music stops, right? So if you're the ACC and you're in all these rumblings about Florida State trying to get out of the conference, or Clemson behind the scenes trying to get out of the conference, you got to make sure you are a viable conference comprised of Power 5 schools. So for example, those schools that left the American and went into the Big 12, all you did was add group of 5 programs to your conference. And quite honestly, those programs are struggling right now, and they should, because it is a big jump in competition. Ask Utah and TCU when they made the jump. They really struggled the first 2 to 3 years. And so that's a natural progression. But at least you're bringing in Power 5 programs. Now, obviously, SMU would be moving up to Power 5. But SMU has the resources as a private school and the funding to become a juggernaut, right? So I think that was attractive for the conference to have something in the DFW area and the Dallas Metroplex. That was really attractive. Do I see the whole Stanford Cal thing? No, I really don't. But again, I think this is about survival. I think it's about when at some point or another, like, I feel terrible for Washington State and Oregon State. That sucks. I mean, think about the financial impact in a negative fashion that's going to have on them if they can't find a way to fit in somewhere at the Power 5 level. They could be looking at an annual revenue of $30 million from a television contract at the Power 5 level to 5. Like, how do you sustain that as a program? So if you, again, Stanford and Cal and they're all just trying to find a landing spot. I think Stanford had enough money or has enough money to where they could have gone independent. They're Stanford, right? I mean, they could have. Cal had no choice but to do this because they have been fiscally irresponsible and their athletic department's been a mess. SMU, as I mentioned, I mean, think about it. Think about how much money they have to be able to fund this for the next 7 years and not even bat an eye. Like, not even bat an eye about it. So they're in a good spot. So does it help? I don't know. Do you look at it from a strength and numbers standpoint? Probably. And then we'll see where it all goes from there once the dust all settles. And that may be, you know, everybody talks about the grant of rights and all of those sorts of things. I mean, the grant of rights, it cost you $120 million just to get out of the league. Then it would cost you another probably $300 to $400 million to fight the grant of rights in court. Well, where are you going to come up with that money? You know, so a lot of jockeying still going on. Let's just say that.
So much money involved. You mentioned Oregon State. I was reading a story that with the non-Pac-12 revenue coming in now starting next year, possibly, that they just redid or did renovations to their stadium, and they were counting on that Pac-12 revenue to pay for the loans and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see what their next move is.
Yeah, you feel
well, and then think of the trickle-down effect. Think of the trickle-down effect. Your biggest revenue producer has to come up with ways to obviously fund new projects, expansion of the stadium or of innovation or build an indoor facility or whatever it may be. But the trickle-down effect is they're also responsible for funding everything else in the athletic department, right? And that's a burden on an athletic department that you just feel terrible about.
Feel awful for Oregon State, a team that's ranked 12th in the country. Like, this is a top 15 program.
They're
right
legit.
Now.
Yeah,
they're really good football team.
Yeah,
Tom, can't thank you enough for your time. Where can everyone see you this weekend? Where will you be heading?
I've got Oklahoma and UCF on ABC at noon Eastern time, which it's going to be interesting because, you know, I think there's two schools of thought. You love to get a bye in the middle of the season when you're tired. You know, you got to get some health, this and that. But when you have an emotional win versus a rival like Oklahoma had versus Texas, you almost feel like, boy, we need to go out and play the next week. Because now it's been 2 weeks of basking in the glow of that win, right? Everybody's patting you on the back, telling you how good you are. And how do you respond to that? Like, do they come out flat? Do they come out and look out of sync? Or do they come out guns a-blazing and ready to roll? I mean, think about this week last year. Think about what the general public, the media narrative, analysts, broadcasters, what have you, were saying about Oklahoma's program this week a year ago. Brent Venables was the wrong guy. They're horrendous on defense. Dylan Gabriel's hurt, and even when he wasn't hurt, he wasn't playing very good. I mean, you talk about flipping the narrative in a short period of time. Brent Venables has done an unbelievable job.
Should be a very fun game. Dylan Gabriel revenge game from UCF originally, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, so should be an exciting one. Looking forward to seeing you there, Tom. Thank you so much again for your insights and analysis. Really appreciate it.
You bet, guys. Appreciate you having me.